Hey folks, so this episode is going to be on leaders, specialists, and experts within the polytheist community. And the first leaders we're going to tackle are administrators. Now, why are we tackling administrators instead of, say, priests, spirit workers, and that kind of thing? Well, they're often the unsung heroes of how our longstanding institutions are going to last. They're the people who show up and do the dirty work of having to interface with the government, of having to do all the financial reporting, the setup of your 501c3s and various other organizations. In order to keep those chugging along and moving, you have to have people whose skills are in administrative work. Because you can be the most excellent priest ever, but if you don't have an administration backing you and you're trying to, say, host a temple, that makes your job so much harder because now you're having to do at least 3 or 4 other jobs on top of being a priest. The point of having administrators, whether it's a board of directors or even a sole administrator that's just doing all the back end work, is so that other people don't have to have that weight in addition to other stuff. My own work, I'm on the board of directors of a pagan spiritual community that we're building, crossing Hedgerows, Sanctuary, and Farm. And part of our work is to make it so that other groups don't have to do the back end work if they want to come and use our land. And I don't do that work alone, because in addition to being a spirit worker, that would also be an administration job. That's a lot for one person to take on. And we share that among ourselves on the board. And the point of being an administrator is so that you empower other people to do the work that needs to get done, so that they don't have to do all that extra background work. So administrators are often unsung heroes, and that's part of why I'm putting them first. Because without those people doing their jobs, it makes other people's jobs that much harder and that much more weight. Because if you like events like Convocation, Michigan Pagan Fest, and your local pagan prides, they need administrative teams to pull those off year after year. Whether it's the board of directors, whether it's the people who make sure that the workshops get put together and that everything runs smoothly the day of the event. So seriously, tip your hats and your wallets to these people, because they're what makes the communities and their events function. Okay, so that being said, what kind of other leaders in the polytheist community are there? Well, in addition to there being, the administrative roles, there's also folks who lead by example. And they may or may not have formal titles, but they're people that are paid attention to. Sometimes they're big name pagans and sometimes they aren't. They might just be somebody in your local community that has a real knack for telling the truth, or for telling you like how it is, even if you don't happen to like the answer. It might be somebody that is a local priest or priestess. It might be somebody that holds honor within a group such as the ADF or OBOD. It might be somebody that is unaffiliated and just has a real knack and a real head for making sure that people hear the things that they need to hear. So, your leaders don't necessarily have to be hierarchical, and they don't necessarily have to be part of a formal structure to be effective and good leaders. Okay, so moving on. What about specialists? So I recently wrote a blog post where I talked about kinds of spiritual specialists, and I'm going to briefly go over some of the spiritual specialists as I understand them. So the most open is spirit worker. There's somebody who does work for the spirits. Their work can range from communicating to divining, engaging in spirit travel, to doing work in one of the worlds, to maintaining a public shrine space so contact can be made between the spirits and the people. Often a spirit worker serves as a connection point between spirits and people within their community. And a spirit worker often serves as a kind of cross between a lot of different spiritual specialists. When other kinds of spiritual specialists are not available, they tend to wear a lot of hats. I know in my own work as a spirit worker, I tend to wear a lot of hats that have a lot of similar function. Up next is a priest. This is somebody who serves a god or a group of gods in the maintenance of their cultus. This is a notion of priest that is very different from what most people in the overculture are probably used to. Most monotheists understand a priest to be like a priest in modern Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy, etc. They serve congregations and not only in the cultus of their god. By contrast, polytheist priests' main roles tend to be the cultus of whatever their god or goddess, group of gods, ancestors, and or spirits are. If this is part of their duties, what their purpose is to do ritual for the gods. Like, that's the long and the short of it. Their job is to do ritual. And it may or may not involve other people. And that really depends on whether or not the priest's role requires it, whether or not their particular calling is to serve people. And if it is, their first duty is likely to the cultus of the god, more so than acting as a go-between between this community and this god or goddess. So they seek to bridge gaps between the god and goddess only when it's really like their responsibility as part of their job duties. What we usually think of in terms of a lot of the job of a priest is what I would consider the job of clergy, and we're going to get into that in just a minute. So where a priest serves a cultist role, a clergy person serves a communal one. And I'm using really broad terms. This may or may not translate to your particular polytheist community, but it at least gives us some place to start. So clergy are those who serve a polytheist community as a spiritual guide, whereas a priest is serving the cultus of a god, goddess, ancestor, group of ancestors, group of spirits. A clergy person is serving communal interests and serving as a bridge between the Ginregen, the holy powers, the mighty powers, and the people. They're often what we think of when we think of priestly duties in this culture. However, I find this to be a completely separate set of skills. So a skilled priest might be really good at giving prayers and offerings to a god, while they might be completely lousy at providing spiritual guidance or counseling. So that's a clergy person's main focus, is they seek to bridge the gaps between the gods, ancestors, spirits, and the members of the communities that they serve. So they also help to bridge their worshipers with the Ginregen, and they help maintain good relationships. Where a priest, again, serves a cultist role, the clergy serves a communal one. So moving on, this is a role that is sometimes encompassed by spirit workers, but I felt like it was important to have this as a separate role, because being a diviner is somebody who serves a community by doing divination. And divination is such a specialized skill set that sometimes your community, if you have enough people in it and you have people that specialize well enough, you could actually have a community diviner. And it's one of the things that I'm starting to see emerge in polytheism, is that we have enough people that these specialties are emerging and people are gravitating towards them. I think that's really a good thing. And it's providing niches for folks to deepen their skills and their work and their craft, and it's also giving people a place to go for specific services. That doesn't have to be just done by one person. Say a high priest or high priestess, or a priest that maybe isn't all that interested in doing divination work. So a diviner is what it says in the tin. This is somebody who does divination. This person may perform only one kind of divination service, or they might perform an entire group of them. This particular spiritual specialist helps community members discern messages, taboos, initiation rituals, and various life events as they're called on to divine. They might also serve communal purposes, and occasionally these are people that will stop in and say, hey, I need to help focus my life, or I'm feeling really lost, can you help me? And so diviners can kind of take on this mediator role between the Ginregen and the people by saying, well, here's the feedback I'm getting. So divination is, in my experience at the time of writing this and then putting this video out, one of the most common skills across polytheist communities for specialists and non-specialists. So the point that I'm trying to make with putting out the points on the spiritual leaders and spiritual specialists and all this isn't that your layperson can't do these things, but that there's communal responsibility and obligation that your average layperson will not have because they don't have these communal responsibilities and roles. It's not that these can't be done, they certainly can by lay people, but oftentimes when you're talking about somebody stepping into an administrative role, you're stepping out of the layperson role into an administrative role. Likewise, when you become a priest and you are serving cultists to the gods on behalf of a community, you cease to be your own person and you're being for the community as well. So that to me is why there is a distinction between your specialists and your non-specialists, your leaders and your non-leaders. Not because person A is more or less inherently holy or worthy, but because they've stepped up into this communal role and they're recognized by the community to do this thing. So we're going to move on. The spiritual specialist that's probably the most controversial at the time of this recording is the sacrificer. This is somebody who performs sacrifice to the gods, ancestors, and or spirits, or collectively I just call them the Ginregen. This person is trained in and performs sacrifice according to best practice and what's required of their particular religion. While most will see the word sacrifice and think only blood sacrifice, and this can be part of the specialty, it's not the only form this can take. This could be somebody who tends to grow a garden full of herbs whose purpose is to become offerings. I don't favor blood sacrifice over the sacrifice of vegetation. And that has to do with how I understand life itself being full of not only balance, but I don't really privilege plant life above animal life in the sense of blood sacrifice must always be inherently more holy or better or more important than that of a plant. Both of these can be sacrificial roles, and they both require certain skills to do well. You need to raise the animal well, or you need to raise the plant well. And raising an animal is certainly not like raising a plant. But the point is that a sacrificer is somebody who does the work of making sure the offering gets to the gods, ancestors, and the spirits in a good way. They take on the risk of a poor sacrifice on themselves, and they perform this service on behalf of a person, a community, etc. And they may do this to help ease the anger of an angry spirit, help heal a group of ancestors, or to please a god during a seasonal rite. Now, it's still looked down upon by the overculture, and a good understanding of what sacrifice is, and with regard to blood sacrifice, how to do it safely, is needed. It's not well understood by even most polytheists, and it's one of the most taboo subjects you could talk about. But it is something that is coming forward as a specialty for many polytheist communities, and it's worth talking about with regards to heathenry, because it is something that is an active topic of conversation and probably a specialty that I imagine will grow as our communities grow and change. So, the next is an operant. Now, this is a catch-all term that I use to describe anybody that works with or uses magic. This can be a witch, a sorcerer, a magician, a seidh worker, a seidh kona, a seidh mother. It can be pretty much anybody that engages with magic and the spiritual fabric of reality. So, given the pervasiveness with which witches dominate the pagan communities, it might seem to be odd that I'm putting this as a separate spiritual specialty within polytheism. But a common denominator I find with operants, whether the word is sorcerer or magician or witch, is that this person engages with magic in some way and the underlying nature of reality through it. Most polytheists engage in exoteric practice and either do very little in the way of magic, or they focus on specific practice like protection. Historically and increasingly in modern polytheism, it's not something commonly done to engage in magic. There's a groundswell of folks who've come out of witchcraft communities, whether through Wicca or through traditional witchcraft, that have found their way into polytheist communities, and they bring that witchcraft with them. And there's nothing wrong with that. But there's a difference between that being your primary spiritual focus or vocation versus being an exoteric practitioner. That is just a lay person or a person who does the outward rituals and symbol work and offerings and prayers that every other heathen does. Witchcraft in heathenry takes on a very different aspect, and when you're having that as your primary focus, as an operant, you are working with the nature of Urthr, of how the weaving or carving of reality unfolds. So there's a large number of things in heathenry to call operants, such as, again, saved workers. Some folks would call runesters or runestrar, rune workers, operants, and others would call them spirit workers. I tend toward the latter, but it still fits the bill here. The point is that not every operant does their specialty for trade. Some do. And some operants work with spirits in various ways, whereas others work completely on their own. But I find that this mode of operating is less prevalent in polytheist circles. Even those who I would consider to be like operants, magicians, sorcerers, wizards, witches, would still have some spirit work of some kind attached to their practice. Moving on is the monastic. This is someone whose primary vocation in life is oriented around and dedicated to a disciplined devotional service to a god, ancestor, spirit, or a group of these. Monastics can come from any walk of life. I've known more than a few. Wonderful people all. Their discipline might be oriented around extreme asceticism, though at least for modern polytheist monastics, this does not tend to be the case. Simple living as a hermit does seem to be one that's a little more popular, or living alongside others in whatever community they happen to find themselves in. That's probably the most common variation of monasticism for modern polytheists. They may have taken vows with a specific group. The ones that come to mind right now are the Matrium of Kybele from Catskills, New York, and the Gnostic Celtic Church's Hermitage of the Heart. But whatever it is, their day begins and ends with devotion to the beings they have dedicated their time, life, and or work to. And it is becoming well, I wouldn't say popular. It is more well known today than it used to be when I first became a polytheist. And the last spiritual specialist type that I'll talk about today is the storyteller. And the storytellers are what they say on the tin. These are people who tell stories of the gods, ancestors, spirits, and or communities. They are the ones that keep and tell stories, particularly sacred and important ones. They're also people that do more than just memorize stories. It is part of that, but they also relate the stories that they hold, whether it's through written prose or poetry, whether it's through oration or song or dance, the gesture, play, or even crafts. Storytelling is literally an embodied story, whether that comes through a tapestry, a song, poems, the spoken word, the recitation, or a 3-act play. Some storytellers may be given new myths, new legends, and new stories to share. And so their job is to pass on these stories and to share this new sacred knowledge. Whereas some storytellers' duty is to only pass on what they were given. And this is something that is going to be, I think, going to become even more important as polytheism goes on. We have been around since about the 60s as an organized bunch of religions, and heathenry in particular, I think, is beginning to really come into its own in this regard. So what are experts as compared to spiritual specialists? Experts, they might be people within our community that, say, hold a PhD. The one that immediately comes to mind is Edward Butler, whose PhD is in philosophy, and he has done an immense amount of work on Platonism. Not my philosophy, but still worthy of recognition. There are other folks whose work is still up and coming that I probably don't know about. But another one that I could point out is Dr. Matthias Nordvig, who is out of the UC Boulder, Colorado. who has written a wonderful couple of books. One is Northern Mythology for Kids, and the other one is a beginner's guide to Ásatrú. And I can put those in the show notes, which I will make sure to do. So check the show notes after you've watched this. I think as time goes on, we're going to have more experts come out of the fields that they hold interest in. And it doesn't necessarily have to be theology, or in our cases with heathenry, Nordic studies. I think that we're going to have folks come at things from a lot of different angles. I think it'd be really cool for a scientist with a doctorate in, say, theoretical physics to talk about intersections between how they understood this scientific principle and how their polytheism affected or didn't affect it. There's plenty of polytheists running around. Myself, I have a bachelor's in psychology, BS in psychology. Make the jokes that you will. And so I think that as we go on in our various careers, we're going to have people who are experts in different fields come to the fore and really represent polytheism in a lot of different ways. And it may not always be religiously relevant, but it's relevant for our religious communities. So that is my very brief overview on leaders, spiritual specialists, and experts within polytheism. So I hope you join me in the next one. Thank you and have a good day.